Hi, I'm back. Let's talk a little bit more about the subject matter of fixtures. You need to understand for the state exam the difference or the definitions of severance or sever and annexation. And we have talked about use the word annexation, which means affixing. And really, annexation is taking something that is personal property and turning it into real property by affixing it to real property. So if you have a bunch of lumber and you buy that at the store, you're buying personal property. You bring that home and you build a barn with it, then that lumber, once it's built in a barn on your property, is now real property because it is a fixture. Same thing if you go and buy all the fixings to make a cement sidewalk. When you buy that, you're buying personal property, but when you take it home and mix it up and pour it to make sidewalks, then that is now real property. So that process is called annexation. There is two types of annexation. It's not addressed directly in your book here. Perhaps you'll cover it in law, but there's actual annexation, which are things we just talked about, and then there's constructive annexation. And constructive annexation is basically where the law deems it to be so associated with the real property that it is indeed, I guess, by law, affixed to the property. Examples of that are keys to your house. Those are not permanently attached to your house, but they don't work anywhere else. And those, by Ohio law, are deemed to be fixtures through constructive annexation. Another example is the garage door openers to your garage. Those always need to be delivered at closing if you're a seller, and those are deemed to be fixtures that are not permanently attached to the house but are associated with that house. And another thing that I know people argue about in real life are the dog collars that go along with the invisible fences. The invisible fence, if you have an invisible fence, that of course stays, and also the dog collars are supposed to go along with it. I personally think that's kind of gross. I'd probably get my own dog collar if I was buying a house with a invisible fence, but Ohio law says that is deemed to be constructively annexed, and so it is a fixture and it's part of the real property. And then the other word you need to be familiar with is severance. That's where you sever something that was part of the real property and now it becomes personal property. If you have a bunch of trees out in your backyard, those trees are part of the real property. Remember from chapter 1, when you buy land, you buy the surface, the subsurface, and everything that's natural that's growing on that land. And so those trees would be part of the real property. Now, if you cut those trees down while you own the property, then those trees immediately become personal property. They're lumber. They've been severed from the real property, and now they are personal property. And while we're on that subject matter, let's talk about plants and natural attachments. I'm kind of skipping around in the book, but this is on page 22. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit differently than what the book has. So what natural attachments are, they are growing, anything that grows on the land. And there's two types. You need to know these words for the exam, for the state exam. You'll never ever need to use them in real life, but somebody deems it important that you know them for the exam. And that's Fructus naturals and Fructus industrials. So Fructus naturals are plants that are plants and trees that are naturally growing on the property. So just think about that. Naturals, natural growing, native growing plants. Fructus industrials, just think of that as man-made. It's industry, so it's man-made. So Fructus industrials are cultivated plants that are in grains and things like that that man, I guess, grows on land. There used to be a distinction, and the book kind of goes through that now, that Fructus naturals were some were one of them was part of the real property and one is not. In today's world, in Ohio law, they view that all as being part of the real property. So if I put a contract in on, if you put a contract in on my house to buy my house, and I do not then have the right to go into my garden and dig up all of my perennial plants and take them and move them to wherever I'm moving to. When you buy my house, you are buying the plants that are attached to my house. And I have Fructus naturals, trees that are naturally growing there. I also have a lot of Fructus industrials, i.e. a lot of perennial plants that I have planted there. And let's see. If you have a perennial plant, that's what I want to talk about, a perennial tree. Well, let's talk about, let's talk about an exception to that, and that's where there's a tenant farmer. There's a special rule. So a tenant farmer is somebody who enters into a lease agreement or a rental agreement with somebody who owns farmland, and then that tenant comes in and works the land and plants, let's just say, wheat and or corn, and waters it and cultivates it for whatever period of time. I'm not a farmer. I don't know whether that's 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, and then comes back and actually harvests the property. So that's what a tenant farmer is. And if a tenant farmer comes in and does that, and then his lease expires, he, by law, has the right to come in after the lease expires and harvest his plants, his cultivated plants, and take those with him. And so if that property is sold while there's a tenant farmer that's farming the land pursuant to a lease, then the crops that that tenant farmer is growing are not part of the land. So that's the special rule, and that applies again to a tenant farmer. And those tenant crops are the crops that the tenant farmer is growing and then harvesting. Those are called embellments, and I think that's EMBLEMENTS, and that is another term that you'll never use in real life, but that you need to know for the state exam. So embellments are crops that are physically attached to a land or to real property that a tenant farmer is growing and has the right to harvest and take off of the land, even though the land may be transferred to another party or sold to another party. They have to honor that tenant farmer lease, and those crops belong to the tenant farmer, not to the new buyer of the land. So that's the exception to the rule. Most crops always go with the real property, and you do not, as the owner or seller, have the right to come back and get those crops, even though you might have put all of the work into it. Now, if you want to decide differently, I've never really sold farmland. If you can certainly write the contract differently that says that those crops belong and will stay with the seller, and the seller has the right to come back and get those property or harvest those crops. But it's all, if it's not stated in the contract, the rule is it stays with the property. And the kind of distinction on all of that is with the tenant farmer, when the tenant farmer can come back and harvest what's left there, even after his lease expires, as long as he started growing it while his lease was valid. The only thing with a perennial tree like a lemon tree or an apple tree or whatever, if that's what he is harvesting and growing, then he only has the right to come back one time to harvest that crop for that particular year. He does not have the right to come back every subsequent year after that. Okay, let's take a break and I'll be back on the next slide.